Well, welcome everyone to episode 5 of the Society for Ethnobotany, the Society for Ethnobotany's Student Cafe series. This is episode 5 on the topic of Beyond Wild and Domestic, Foraging Ethnobotany in Tanzania, with our guest, Dr. Matthew Knisley. Before we get started, there's a couple items that we'd like to address. I believe, Heike, would you like to discuss memberships?
Well, we do these, the Society for Ethnobotany is a relatively small society, but it is very appropriate for everybody who works in ethnobotany. I hope some of you, if you are not members yet, you would like to be members, even though these student cafes are public, but we also have quite a few events that are for our members and that are useful. And of course, you get discounts in our annual meetings. But in general, I would just like to say welcome. I would like to say thank you to our speaker, Dr. Knisley, who will talk about something that is a very one of the important subjects in ethnobotany, which is foraging, using wild growing resources. So welcome everybody here. And if you're not a member, consider being one. For students, it's not very onerous what we ask for as far as dues go, and you do get quite a lot of benefits. Thank you, and go ahead.
Great, thank you. I would also like to advertise briefly that the annual conference will be taking place this summer, June 15th through 19th in Grand Rapids, Michigan. The student committee is busy planning some student social activities for that. So it should be fun, not just for like paid professionals, but early career and student members as well. And there is, it sounds like, a session being organized for African leafy vegetables. So check that out. Great. So we'll get started. I'd like to briefly introduce you, Matthew, and then you can get rolling. So Matthew's research examines African foraging societies and their transformations in relation to the spread of food production and increasingly global exchange. He completed his undergraduate at Washington University in St. Louis and his master's and PhD degrees at the University of Chicago. He is currently a postdoc research associate at Washington University in St. Louis once again, so might feel a little bit of a homecoming. As part of this fellowship, he is helping to build the first physical and digital comparative collection of wild plants for Eastern Africa to be housed in Tanzania, Kenya, and the United States. This collection will be used to study plant remains from 3 archaeological sites that span the last 50,000 years. In today's talk, Matthew will describe ethnobotanical research with the Sandawe in relation to changing views of African foraging communities. And just to brag on him a little bit, amongst his research, some of his accomplishments are several grants. He received a Fulbright in 2004 to spend a year studying ethnobotany with and like the role of edible weedy greens in the diet and agricultural practices of the Sandawe people. He's also received a Wenner grant in 2016 to fuel his dissertation research and a National Science Foundation grant in 2020. So without further ado, we'd like to welcome Dr. Matthew Knisley on his topic today. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here and talk to everybody. This project I did a long time ago, and it probably counts more as historical anthropology than ethnography at this point. But it's still fun to talk about, and I'm hoping to get at least one article published about it soon. And part of why it will be good to talk to all of you is that one of the benefits of having waited a long time between doing the research and now sitting down to write it up is that I've had time to think about it a lot. And one of the things that I'm hoping to walk through with you today is how my thinking about this project has changed. And another thing that I will say, and I can go into detail at this later on if we have time, is that my current archaeological work in many ways grew out of this ethnobotanical work. So I'm still working in the same part of Tanzania, but this ethnobotanical project got me thinking about longer term history of this region and its inhabitants. And so for my graduate study, I eventually started doing archaeology. But for me, the earlier ethnobotanical work and the contemporary archaeological work are very much related, sort of a piece. So I'm happy to go into that. And once I switch over to the presentation, you'll see that I also have two different titles because I can't choose one because, as I mentioned, my own thinking sort of keeps going back and forth on this. So let me share the screen and get started. And can you see that okay? Great. So the two titles that I've been debating are Beyond Wild and Domestic. And one of the reasons that I've been thinking about this is that, and as I will go into in a few minutes, much of this research was premised on the assumption that the Sandawe were hunter-gatherers until the very recent past and continue to rely very heavily on foraging. But over the course of doing this research, I realized that their food-getting repertoire is very diverse and probably has been for quite some time. And so in addition to thinking about how ethnobotanists and anthropologists and others can most effectively describe the diverse ways that people relate with their environments, it also got me thinking about how anthropologists and other historically oriented disciplines think about foraging and farming and transitions from one to another. So that's a little bit broader level. I've also been thinking about calling it something like cultivating resistance, because one of the things that's really interesting to me when you look at some of the, especially the older accounts, ethnographic accounts of the Sandawe in the 1800s and early 1900s, is there's a lot written about how they avoided in different ways interaction with the colonial state that was forming during that time, and the ways that how landscape occupation actually helped them to guide or helped them to limit how they interacted with different groups of people. And so one thing that I was thinking about was how their use of vegetables, which I'm going to be talking about, could potentially be yet another sort of reflection, sort of an ongoing legacy of that longer term history. So just a couple of ideas. So just to give you a sense of where I'm talking about, it's in north central Tanzania, and we've got the map of Tanzania, and then the Sandawe homeland is in blue. And I wanted to throw this picture up. It's one of my favorite pictures of the landscape. Actually, let me go back to the title. So you can see during the rainy season, it can get quite green and vegetated, and you can even tell when it's brown that there is a lot of vegetation. But I especially like this picture because it helps me to explain to people why doing the ethnobotanical work was very easy, but doing the archaeological work was much more challenging. When you're doing archaeological work, especially when you're starting in a new area, you spend a lot of time walking across the landscape and looking at the ground for artifacts on the surface. And it was rather difficult to do here. So it's very hilly, lots of vegetation. It's a really pretty place. And I put together this project towards the end of my time at Washington University as an undergrad. I had majored in anthropology. I had been to Tanzania for a semester. I was interested in going back, and I wanted to apply for a Fulbright grant that would support me to do it. I also knew that I was interested in ethnobotany. I was interested in hunting and gathering. And so some of my advisors here helped me design a project. And one of the things with the Fulbright is, in addition to describing a project that's conceptually interesting, you have to, I mean, this is the case in a lot of grants, but especially for the Fulbright, you have to talk about some of the broader implications and impacts that could come from the study. So the reason that we settled on leafy vegetables is because leafy vegetables are widely consumed in Africa. They're oftentimes very very quick to grow and easy to grow. They're very nutritious. But one of the challenges is that many of them are very widespread. And so botanists don't necessarily study them because they're not, I mean, they're very well-known plants in many cases. But also people who study things like agricultural economics might not study them because they're often grown very informally and not as a cash crop. Although there is some, you can get some of these vegetables in markets. And when you look at the existing studies, many of them are relatively short term and also quantitative. And there's also a lot of disagreement in terms of how terms like indigenous, traditional, leafy, even vegetable get used. And the article that I have at the bottom of the slide provides a really good overview of how the ways that people conceptualize those terms have impacted what gets studied and what doesn't. So, for example, should indigenous only refer to species that appear to be endemic to Africa? Or should they include crops from the New World that have been a part and a critical part of African food systems since 1500, so the last 500 years? And sort of where you draw the line can impact the kinds of things that you study. In my own case, I had originally proposed to study, the way I phrased it was weedy greens. And one of the things that came up when talking about this project with people both in the United States and Tanzania is that although many of the plants are weedy in an ecological sense, they thrive in disturbed environments. The term weed also has negative connotations, so you have to be very careful about the kinds of terminology that gets used. Some of the larger impacts of this kind of study are that by not having a solid understanding of the range of species that get used, less common crops can't be identified and tested in other regions. You're not going to be able to develop new varieties or hybrids. And then also, if we see a decline in the range of things that people are using, that could lead to decreased resiliency in food systems. Regarding the Sandawe and why I chose to go to that area to work, the Sandawe are very interesting within anthropological scholarship because they're one of two groups in Tanzania who speak languages that have click consonants in them. And by virtue of that linguistic attribute and these hunting and gathering traditions, this idea that they either are hunter-gatherers in the present or have been in the recent past, there have been a lot of attempts to associate the Sandawe with the hunting and gathering groups in Southern Africa. But one of the interesting things is that if you look at anthropological scholarship over the long term, oftentimes people focused on sort of ideal representations of whatever they were studying. And so the Sandawe were doing some foraging, but they were also engaged in farming and raising livestock. So they weren't perfect foragers, but they also weren't perfect farmers or perfect pastoralists. And so that's one of the reasons that I think people didn't study them. And yet there was this recognition that by virtue of their sort of association with hunting and gathering, that they might be able to tell us something about their contemporary lifeways might be able to tell us something about longer term histories of Africa. So the idea was to bring together this important, a study of this very important kind of food with this study of this group that has been very interesting, but relatively understudied within anthropology. And I wanted to say that because my current thinking is very different in terms of why I think this study is important. And I think it's really valuable for researchers to talk about the kinds of ideas that they go into a project with, and also how they change over the course of doing the research. And this is also really one of the benefits of doing qualitative research and long-term research, because it gives you the time to really be in a place, get to know people, get to know what they're doing, and also have your own assumptions challenged in the process. So, and as I mentioned, just a couple of slides to talk about a little bit more about the Sandawe and their place within larger anthropological thinking. One of the things that I began to notice after doing this research is that really in a lot of ways, how the Sandawe were described in the 1800s is really how they're described today. And that struck me as an interesting historical question. So, and I can talk about this later. But for my master's work, one thing that I actually looked at was how did it even come to be that the Sandawe, who already had a diverse food getting repertoire in the 1800s, came to really only be thought of as foragers, and how did that categorization persist for so long? And this is a language map that you'll often see when talking about long-term histories of Africa. And the blue here are the languages that have click consonants in them. And so the idea, the general idea is that these languages were spoken by groups that the ancestors of present day groups who speak these languages were this once widespread community of foragers across Africa, and that the contemporary speakers of these languages are sort of the descendants of those groups that have managed to survive culturally into the present. As it turns out, there is now a lot of debate among linguists, and it's thought that that those might actually represent multiple language families, and that the seemingly unique linguistic trait, those click consonants, might actually need some other explanation than common descent. So when I was doing the research, since I was there, so basically I proposed to do 12 months of research, and I had just finished an anthropology major. I had just learned a lot of research methods. And so really, I just wanted to go out and try out methods I had already used for some of my classes here, but also to try new methods that I'd only read about. And one of the things that I did at the beginning was to conduct a village census. And some of that was to get a sense of the different ethnic and linguistic communities that were living in the village where I was based, but also it was a way to introduce myself and the project, just to familiarize myself. And another thing that I did was I started out by doing a lot of in-garden and in-field interviews. So what you sometimes hear is called walkabouts or something similar. And basically just saying, what do you grow? What are the different things that you might not grow, but that you eat and can get here? And started to collect the names just so that I could begin familiarizing myself with the plants and the landscape. So once I started to build up a list of names in my own mind, being able to ask people, where do these grow? Do they only grow in the fields? Do they grow away from the fields? Can you grow them in gardens? Things like that. And then I also began collecting voucher specimens to have them identified by botanists. And I also did participant observation to go out and actually help people harvest some of the greens, to help them cook them and dry them, which I found out was very important. And one second. Well, that's okay. I, for some reason, can't go back. No. Why? Oh, there we go. I have to use a different arrow. Okay. And then to the extent that I could, I also tried to weigh greens to get a sense of how much people were eating. And I also experimented with a few different methods, like food diaries, where people keep track of what they're writing or keep track of what they're eating over time. Because sometimes people might forget after a few days what they've had. And so writing it down every day is one way to try to get a better sense of what people are eating. I also did group discussions to understand local understandings of the year. So, of course, there's a rainy season and a dry season, but I wanted to talk to people about what times of year do you do particular kinds of activities related to food. And I also did what's called pile sorting, which is a method that you can use to understand taxonomies. So we have a botanical taxonomy, but that's different from how non-botanists categorize the world. And so this was one way for me to understand how the Sandawe think about the range of species. I also went out and, as time allowed, would really, and kind of just for fun, would also learn about and collect other kinds of wild foods other than leafy vegetables. So during the rainy season one year, we went out and went mushroom hunting, which was really great. So I grew up in a small town in Illinois, and that's one thing we always did in the spring. So I really enjoyed being able to do that with folks in Tanzania. One thing that came out over the course of doing the interviews, and this is one nice thing about doing long-term qualitative research, is that it gives you a chance to pursue whatever you realize over the course of doing the research actually. And one thing that came up from having spoken to people while they were cooking is that there were different kinds of salts and sodas that you used for different kinds of vegetables for different purposes while you were cooking. And so I spent a lot of time going to the places where these salts and sodas were produced to learn more about that process, which was a lot of fun. So over the course of the year, I recorded 66 different species. Since then, I've been going back since this project, and there have been at least 6 others that that I have learned about, but I don't include them here because I wasn't able to really learn about them systematically. But there's more than what I talk about. So I recorded 66 species. Of those, most of them are eaten for the leaves. Some of them are eaten for the flowers. Most of them are annual, 55 of those species, but there are 11 perennial species, such as mainly trees and larger shrubs, things like that. And they're approximately evenly split between wild, domestic, and semi-domestic species. And 22 of the species are dried and are available year-round, in addition to being eaten fresh. And these are just going to be some general observations before I jump into some more of what I have come to find a little bit more interesting. So the serving size was about 100 grams. One really interesting thing that came up with trying to establish that is I would actually stop people opportunistically if I saw them just like out gathering vegetables or having recently come home. Because one thing that came out of doing the research was that it was considered to be a little too intrusive if I were to ask about how much of the vegetables that they had dried and stored, for example. That was, people were happy to talk about how they use the vegetables. But the idea of actually going in and like measuring what people have saved away to use over the course of the year, that was considered to be a little too sensitive and intrusive. But asking people to weigh things sort of before they start cooking, that was fine. And I did that quite a bit over the course of the year, and it came out to about 100 grams per person. The drying, when I talked to people about that, it was to increase the predictability and the reliability of having access to vegetables. And some of those they're all dried whole. Some of them are stored whole. Some of them are actually crushed into a powder, and I'll come back to that later. Young leaves are considered to be the most palatable, but more mature leaves were often eaten, although sometimes they required additional processing, such as boiling and multiple changes of water, or crushing them to try to soften them up before you cook them. And one thing that I also noticed is there were very few gardens, although I'll talk about this as well. Most people grew what sprouted on its own or that they had planted in their fields. Just some other random things that came up that I found kind of interesting. 2 of the species turn red if they sit overnight, and so the leftovers are not consumed, and only the amount that you expect to eat is going to be picked. They taste fine, but the color was considered unappealing, and so this was like only eaten in the amount that you were planning to eat. But all of the others, people would eat leftovers. One thing that came out that I was interested in was gender dynamics, and of course, my ability to understand that fully is going to be limited, but it really was the case that women did seem to do a lot of the work of cultivating and harvesting and processing a lot of these vegetables, but men also did know and also helped, even if they claimed otherwise. It just sort of depended on how I asked the question and the situation where I was talking about it. And also it was kind of interesting about with participating in cooking. So cooking was often done by women, but given that I was a researcher, it was typically okay for me to be in kitchens that didn't really cause any problems. And certainly men also cook too. But I'm happy to talk about like how to think about navigating gender in research. And I already mentioned this about the household secrets. So happy to have hesitant to have stores of foodways, but we're happy to discuss sensitive things in general terms. And this is an area where every few years there is, it sort of fluctuates. They often have heavy rains or drought. And so people do experience food insecurity somewhat regularly here. So this was a pretty sensitive issue. Food and medicine are interrelated to a certain extent. So some of these species were also used medicinally. And in that case, they you wouldn't change the water and you wouldn't add salt to it. And in some cases, you'd want the water rather than the vegetable itself that was cooked. And there was a larger sort of culinary tradition around these. So there were a couple of wild fruits, bitter and sweet, that were used to flavor cooked vegetables. As I already mentioned, salts and sodas might also be contributing things like minerals, and were used in the preparation of particular kinds of dishes. And you could think of these as condiments. Most people didn't really think of them as food, although they did think of them as important to cooking the leafy vegetables. And here are a couple of pictures of the gardens. So on the left, this was the reason I included this is because this woman was growing a variety of amaranthus that she had gotten the seeds from a mission group that had come through a few years prior. And so she had started growing this in a garden near her house. And some of her friends really liked it and so began sharing the seed. So it was one situation in which I could actually watch it, sort of a new variety of vegetable be introduced into the area. And people are still growing this. It's not especially widespread, but it is still grown. And then on the right, this is an example of somebody. So a lot of the vegetables, especially the semi-domestic vegetables, are allowed. They're sometimes purposely put into fields, either by people saving seeds and spreading them, or through manuring, which is known to contain seeds of valuable plants. But in the fields, those plants are allowed to remain until they begin to compete with the primary crops, like corn and sorghum and millet. And when they get to be rather large, they are uprooted whole, taken back to the house, and then the leaves are plucked off and then dried in the sun. And so that's what this woman is doing here, is plucking the leaves off. And then these are just a couple of other pictures from some of the gardens. So like I said, gardens are relatively small near people's homes. For the most part, people are gathering things that are growing in the fields or just across the landscape. And when the reason that people do decide to grow things close to home are if it's a vegetable that they especially like to eat, or if it's something that requires a lot of water. So in the lower left, this is a variety of sweet potato that has long, skinny leaves. And this woman lives near one of the wells in town. And so she was able to construct almost like a little irrigation trench. So some of the runoff from the well would come in and water the sweet potato. And I'll skip over this because I want to make sure that we have time. Oh, actually, I will talk about on the bottom right, there's the striped fruit with no thorns or no spikes. These plants, these are all cucurbits, and they are eaten for the leaves, but the fruits are very bitter. But here on the lower right, there was one community in particular where they called me over and they were like, hey, you should come look at this. And somebody had noticed that one of the fruits in their garden didn't have spikes on it. And so they tried to eat it, and it was not bitter like the other two are. And so now they just eat them like cucumbers. And I've been meaning to ask to see if people have actually started cultivating this more, but this seemed to be kind of like a serendipitous discovery of a change to something. Here's some pictures from the salt and soda collection, which I can come back to, but I'll skip over just so that we have time for Q&A. So now I want to get into, sort of how my own thinking changed. So as I mentioned, I went into this on the presumption that the Sandawe were hunter-gatherers until a very recent past, and were in the process of adopting and relying more heavily on agriculture and domestic livestock. And so the project was oriented around trying to understand what role do wild species, especially these leafy vegetables, play in the diet of the Sandawe, and why are they deciding to use particular species over others? But when I actually got into it and started looking at the range of species that are being used and how they're used across the landscape, I realized it was much more complicated picture than that. So it is true that domestic species are only in fields and gardens, and wild species tend to grow beyond the fields in more heavily vegetated areas, but they do often grow all over the place. And some, like baobab trees, are cultivated to a certain extent. The semi-domestic species, especially things like amaranthus, they grow in fields, but also in disturbed areas, but there are lots of kinds of disturbed areas. And so people knew that particular kinds of species would be associated with abandoned homesteads, for example. And so it really, what I was starting to realize was it didn't really make sense. Although people, did talk about how particular kinds of species could be found in different places on the landscape, these categories of wild, semi-domestic, and domestic, which were important to me due to my training as an anthropologist, really weren't salient to them. And so that was one thing that I started, thinking about and playing around with. And it started to come out a little bit more when I did these community calendars. So one of the things that we did was when I went into that, I sort of framed it as I would like to know how you sort of think about how you use your time over the course of the year, and let the folks who I was talking with bring up the important categories. And these were some of the things that came up. So they wanted to talk about when the temperature, the rains, when they're planting in the field, when they're harvesting in the field. But they also wanted to talk about things like when is hunger most likely in a bad rain year, or more accurately, the year after a bad rain year, because sometimes if you have a bad rain year, people don't plant and they have enough stores that can carry them through. But if you don't have a good rain year the next year, that's when you really start to have a problem. We also talked about things like when are people most likely to be sick with things like malaria? When are most people likely to plan things like weddings? Also, when do you have access to resources like milk? And also and so I'll come back to some of this in a bit, but one of the other things that was really helpful for changing my own thinking was this folk taxonomy exercise. So these are some of the major categories that the Sandawe use when they talk about vegetables. So overarching is just leafy vegetables is the overarching category, but then they split them into vegetables that are used to make them chicha, which is just for the most part, you can just think of it as like a sauteed leaf. But then there's vegetables that are used to make mlenda. And mlenda are vegetables that, when they are crushed and boiled, become mucilaginous. They're kind of sticky. And within each of those categories, people distinguished between species that you can only eat at the beginning of the rains, and you only eat them fresh, and then other species that have a longer period of availability and that you can dry and eat into the dry season. And so each of the mlenda and mchicha categories also have these subcategories for things that are only eaten fresh at the beginning of the rains, things that are only eaten dried can be eaten fresh, but are also dried and available through the rest of the year. One of the things that came up over the course of doing the interviews is that people are especially, they especially like the category on the lower left, which is called Fumuru. And these are mainly wild species, actually. And so we sat down and we put together another calendar of when during the year each of the different kinds of species are available. And I'll sort of show you how my way of thinking about it and their way of thinking about it helped me come up with a different way of thinking about the project as a whole. So when you're looking at wild, domestic, and semi-domestic species as a whole, they both follow, for the most part, the same general kind of a trend. So they are more available in the rainy season, so from between like January and April, and then begin to drop off. And you can see that taken together, you have this really huge spike in around February at the beginning of the rains that then drops off pretty drastically. Although some things are available fresh even throughout the dry season. What was really interesting is that you can see how the availability kind of switches when you look at fresh versus dried. So everything, sort of regardless of wild, domestic, semi-domestic, a lot of things are available fresh at the beginning of the year, and then they drop off in the last half of the year. And then there's really a switch around June when people stop prioritizing fresh vegetables and really begin to eat the dried vegetables. But what was really interesting to me about how these work together, and I should probably come up with a chart or like put an arrow, but in November and December, when you have that uptick in the blue, in the lower right of the chart, those are all wild species, and they all fall in this category in the lower left, which are the wild species that tend to only be eaten at the beginning of the rains. So after having done this research, like I said, I started to realize that the way I was thinking about wild, domestic, semi-domestic didn't really work. And I started to realize that, and so I had originally hoped that maybe this research would help me think about sort of the transition from foraging to food production. I don't necessarily think that there's any straightforward way to extrapolate from this into the past, but it did allow me to think about a lot of really interesting possibilities. So one thing, and this is where this goes back to one of the second title that I've been playing with, which is cultivating resistance, is one thing that I've been wondering is, did the adoption of domestic species and semi-domestic species, were they taken up in such a way that actually, so the idea that I've been playing with is that perhaps more intensive cultivation of domestic and semi-domestic species in combination with wild species actually allowed the Sandawe to a certain extent to maintain a foraging ethos. So did it allow them to continue to occupy the landscape potentially in ways that, like I said, allowed them to maintain certain levels of freedom as groups were starting to encroach around them? I don't know. It's just an idea, something I'm playing with. But one thing that was certainly became very obvious over the course of doing the project is that when I actually look at the range of species they use, how they use them across the landscape and over the course of the year, I realized that the system very much exceeded a lot of the categories that I went into it with. So I've already mentioned the wild, domestic, semi-domestic. It's useful to think about them in that way in terms of the ways that the different plants need to be tended, but it's also not the most salient way that Sandawe think about them. If we want to think about intensive versus extensive production, yes, there are elements of both of that. So the semi-domestic things in the field, you could think of as a more intensive kind of production, but harvesting greens from things like abandoned homesteads or abandoned livestock enclosures could be more of an extensive kind of system. There are aspects of this that are foraging. People certainly gather things opportunistically. They go out into the landscape. They keep track of where these things are, and they go out when they need them. But there is also cultivation. There's also farming, and the entire landscape is in some sense and to some extent cultivated. There are aspects of it that seem both robust and at risk. There are aspects of it that we might want to call traditional and conventional. So one thing that I saw, I didn't have a picture of this, but people have started to put in more formalized and intensive gardens in order to sell vegetables at markets. And so, of course, like a lot of these kinds of categories really, I mean, we all know they form a continuum. And so this is just an example of that. But the reason that I want to present this research in a way that really draws out some of this diversity is that I think it complicates a lot of the ideas that I went into the project with. I went in with this very sort of straightforward understanding of like, these vegetables are important. The Sandawe probably aren't using them anymore. We need to understand why. And it's like, the Sandawe are eating all sorts of things, and they probably have been for a very long time. And I think this project has helped me think a little more critically about the ideas that we use to guide our research and how we can allow the research to speak back to the more abstract ideas. And I'll stop here, but like I said, this research did end up leading me to think more about how the Sandawe came to be categorized as hunter-gatherers in the first place, but also paying more attention to what was in the published literature that suggested more complicated, longer-term histories than we had perhaps fully recognized. And so then when I did my PhD, that's when I switched over to doing archaeological work in the area. So like I said, there really is kind of a through line from my research from the leafy vegetables to the more archaeological component of it today. And as it turns out, like I said, this postdoc, I sort of get to come back to the ethnobotany because starting next month, we're going to be building a comparative collection of plants that will help us study plant use in the past archaeologically. So I'll leave it there and open it up for questions.
Great, thank you, Matthew. That was really great to hear about all of your research and the different intricacies you found that broke the mold that you were expecting to find, like the binary of wild and domestic. So I'll go ahead with a question of my own, but if to allow people to kind of come up with their own questions, you can either drop them in chat and I can read them aloud, or you can go ahead and you should be able to do the little raise hand and ask it yourself. So I found it interesting. So you mentioned the change and people, it's like kind of suite of growing plants in order to grow stuff at the garden. I noticed in a lot of the pictures amongst the gardens of leafy vegetables, there's also either like corn or millet being grown.
Mm-hmm.
So how did that play at all into the leafy vegetable suite, or was it just like that was being grown for grain?
Yeah, so those are the primary crops that are grown in this area are millet, sorghum, corn, and then increasingly sunflower, and also lesser, but sesame. And the sesame and sunflower are grown for both, those are grown as oil crops, but the others are consumed locally. And the way in which a lot of these vegetables are eaten is along as a relish. Well, relish sort of implies that it's more of a condiment, but as they're eaten alongside the grains. And so the grains tend to be ground and then cooked into a stiff porridge. And so you'll oftentimes eat pieces, it's called ugali in Tanzania, break off pieces of that and eat it with the leafy vegetables. So in terms of like where the majority of people's calories are coming from, it's those grains like sorghum and millet. But in terms of the vegetables the fruits and vegetables that people are eating, it's almost entirely these leafy vegetables. There are some fruits, but it is pretty dry, and so it's difficult to grow. I mean, there are lots of wild fruits, but there are very few fruits that are grown locally just because they require too much water. So, and people do eat the fruits, and it certainly does form an important part of people's diets, but on a day-to-day basis, the majority of the vegetables they're consuming are in fact the leafy vegetable species.
Well, thank
yes,
you.
Heike.
Well, thank you very much, because that's a lot. How do you say that? A lot of what you say is very similar to what we see here in Mesoamerica. I'm based in Mexico, you need to know that. Also work a little bit on leafy greens, and a number of my students do. So that was quite interesting, because there are a lot of parallelisms. I don't know.
Yeah, one of the first articles I'd read was about quelites by Bai.
By and there's a whole literature on that here in Mesoamerica, particularly in Mexico. Yeah, so that will be interesting. I have a couple of questions, partially on the methods, if people write down what they eat, that it said, if you can do food diaries, that means that people are literate, right?
Mhm.
So they go to school and so on, which also, at least from what we see here in Mexico, is a factor for occupying labor. That is, mothers have to take their kids to school and so on, so they have less time, which we found was a factor in reducing to an extent the use of wild greens, because women don't have less time, no. But I just wanted to. So, and did you speak the language? Or
Yeah.
how did
So
you do?
yeah, I conducted most of my research in Swahili. So
Okay, yeah, so
most
people are bilingual generally.
yeah, most Tanzanians are bilingual.
Okay.
There are some of the older folks only spoke Sandawe, and I can only do really greetings and plant names at this point in
Yeah,
Sandawe.
yeah.
So if I was doing an interview with somebody who only spoke Sandawe, I did have a research assistant who was bilingual and who could help translate. But it was certainly the case. I had to be pretty careful because when I first started, some of the terms that people were using, like mchicha or mlenda, which in Swahili refer to, like I said, basically things that you saute versus things that are boiled. I very quickly, as you can imagine, was very confused because I was like, I think those are different plants, but you're saying they're both mchicha. And they're like, they are. And they're like, do you want to know what it's called in Sandawe? And I was like, yes.
Yes.
So I had to be very careful about, especially when we were talking about, about making sure, okay, were we talking about this in Swahili or are we referring to this using the Sandawe names? And sometimes what I thought was really interesting is there were a couple of situations where they recognize varieties that botanists wouldn't. So the same species that have different sort of like growth habits, things like that. And so, but what I thought was kind of interesting is that there were cases where they would describe the varieties to me using terms that were actually, so they would oftentimes use Swahili adjectives to describe the difference across the varieties, but they would actually refer to the varieties oftentimes just with one word in Sandawe. So it'd be like, well, there's like two kinds of that. We have the upright one and we have the one that climbs. Sort of the vine versus the more sort of like shrubby upright one. So I had to be very careful about that. It was very confusing to try to keep track of all of that. One thing that came up as well with the food diaries in the end actually weren't that useful, to be quite honest, because they were really interesting and fun, and I enjoyed talking to the people who were writing them. But one of the things that I realized was that, again, in the diaries, they would sometimes use the more generic terms. And so it was useful for me to understand like how many meals have greens, but it wasn't necessarily helpful for me to understand which greens were being consumed. Because they might not always specify the individual kinds. And if it was in the dry season and they were eating dried things, those might have been mixed together and they might not necessarily know, they might know the range of species that went in it, but they might not know exactly what they were eating in any particular meal. So there were lots of fun, interesting things that came up in that regard. So I did them. They really, in the end, were not useful for what I had intended them to be, but they were still useful in the sense
for
that
other things,
right.
Yeah.
But it was also a good lesson in terms of like if you are going to use a method that requires pretty active participation on the part of somebody else, you also have to be very careful in terms of thinking about how you explain it and how you train them and how often you check in to see how it's going and if there have been any problems, things like that.
That applies to students also.
Yes. Yes. I've taught a lot and I can confirm.
Now, I know they dry a lot of leafy greens in Africa. Here in Mexico, they generally don't, even though there are some places in the north where they do. So I have been thinking that it might have to do in Mexico, we have a very strong system of weekly markets. And I know that in Africa, in some places they do, and in other places they don't.
Mhm.
And I have the idea that people don't dry it in the areas where they have easy access to eucalyptus through the weekly markets where almost everybody goes.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you have something like that in your study area.
Yeah, I certainly think that is the case. So in the study area, there is a market system, but it's a monthly market system. And for the most part, the only foods that are being sold, the only not, well, people sell livestock at those, of course, but well, you might not know that they do. That's a big livestock market, or these monthly markets. The only food that is sold food tends to be beer, things like that, locally brewed beer, or fruit that has been brought in. So things like on big trucks, so like pineapples, sugarcane, things that are grown on the coast or elsewhere in Tanzania. And yes, I certainly do think it's the case that that's probably what would be found. One thing that I think would be an interesting follow-up question, as I mentioned, right around the time in the few years leading up to me doing the project, the local high school started to teach students of how to grow little raised garden beds to grow leafy vegetables. And so what I noticed around town is that a lot of the houses that would have these raised garden beds had a high school student who was basically trying out at home what they had been doing at school. But that also kind of had spread into one of the local communities. And a lot of the families there had started digging by hand really deep water retention ponds, and were using that to more intensively cultivate vegetables that they would then sell as a source of income in some of the local markets. But they were pretty limited when I did this research on how far they were selling it really quite locally. But it would be interesting to see if that has continued and how that has impacted what people are eating right around that town.
It would be interesting to have a look at how market systems influence what people grow.
One thing that
Yeah.
came up is that one of the most commonly purchased greens are things like cabbage, because it's very filling, but it also requires quite a bit of water, so it's not really grown locally. And that was what I mean was always coming up, was that people would say I would grow a lot of other things, but that the regular access to water is really the limiting. So I would say like the access to these markets and also the access to the water really does seem to limit what people are growing.
Well, I don't want to monopolize too much of this time, but maybe we can exchange some emails. I just wanted to know if you are using domestic and domesticated as synonyms, or if these are different terms for you.
So I know that there's a lot of debate about this. What I was referring to here is I was really just referring to species that have to be purposefully re-sown. And what I was meaning here by semi-domestic,
cultivated plants, basically.
Yeah.
Okay.
But then with the semi-domestic things, this is referring to, there are a lot of things that the semi-domestic category is especially mushy in how I've been using it here. They tend to be things like crop relatives. So there are a lot of wild sesames that fall into the category of the semi-domestic. Those actually do grow on their own, but they also tend to grow in disturbed places. And they're the ones that people do also collect the seeds, but some people don't
throw them around somewhere where they think, so they're like.
So I could certainly be much more careful in specifying what I mean by those terms when I write it up. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions? If not, I can fire another one at you.
Sure.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm happy to hear from other people. And if you don't like asking questions on a format like this, you can get my email address from the organizers and feel free to send me a note.
Yeah, I can make that available. You might see a follow-up email from Amelia for those of you who have registered for this.
Or in the chat. You're
Or in the
okay
chat.
with that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's true. I'll just type it in now.
Great. So I was wondering like how like any effects of climate change might affect this like leafy vegetable system or just the general like environment with the people that you were talking with.
Mhm. So even when I don't have really good data to talk about how things have changed in the last almost 20 years since I did this project. It's crazy to think about. But even when I did the project, people were saying that they had noticed changes in the rainfall. And so the rainy season, there tends to be a period of short rains followed by a brief pause and then the long rains. And many people have said that the short rains have almost disappeared completely. I don't know if that is still the case. But it is certainly a subject of a lot of local conversation, is that people have talked about that the rains seem more erratic or the schedule seems less predictable, and that and it certainly is the case that a lot of people have struggled with food insecurity, because one of the questions becomes, if the rains are really delayed, do you try to rely on your stores until the next year, or do you go ahead and prepare the fields and expend all that labor on the off chance that the rains are going to come? This year, they're actually having the opposite problem. So Eastern and Southern Africa are also affected by the El Nino weather pattern. And during El Nino years, they actually have excessive rainfall. So this year, a lot of the roads have been really heavily damaged. And a lot of, not just roads, a lot of infrastructure has been damaged due to really wide scale flooding in this part of Tanzania. So yes. And I mean, in some ways, my guess would be that that means that, I mean, I don't think that the leafy vegetables are at risk of going away soon, because they, that like it is a system that is in some sense like in at least in some sense is designed to help deal with some of those unpredictabilities, like especially the drying and things like that. So my sense is that it wouldn't necessarily then be at risk, but also it would be worthwhile to talk to people about and try to get data to be like, how have the rains changed in recent years? And have you made any decisions as a response to that? And how have these plants played a role, if any? I think those would be really good follow-up research questions. But based on the research I did at that time, I can't speak to it directly.
Gotcha. Thank you. I'll read Tabitha Faber's question. Really interesting, Matthew. Thank you. For the span of taxa that you have encountered in Tanzania, how variable are the tastes, flavors of the leafy vegetables? Are some also considered medicinal in addition to edible and nutritious, or are there other use categories associated with these plants?
There's actually quite a range in taste and flavor, and there are certainly some species that are really widely used by everybody. But one of the things that came out in doing in the pile sorting, for example, so especially for the Mlenda, which is the boiled vegetables that become kind of mucilaginous, there was a core set of species that people often described as like forming the base of that dish. But then there were other species that people pointed to say you can add it based on the flavor that you're going for. So there are some species that have like a slightly saltier flavor or a tart flavor. And so those get added in to change the taste. And there were a couple that were considered to be medicinal. One was a species of aloe, and that and then another was Cleome or Cleome gynandra. And that one, you cook it, but if you're going to use it, you put it in water. And if you're going to use it medicinally, you wouldn't change the water. You would either eat, and in most cases, you actually would then drink the water that it's boiled in. But if you're eating that particular species as a vegetable, oftentimes you'll boil it and then fry it. If it's a more mature leaf, if it's a young leaf, you can just saute it directly. So yeah, there were differences in preparation, but if it's being used medicinally, then you would prepare it in a different way than you would if you're going to eat it. Oh, and in other use categories, for most of these, they're used for mainly for vegetables. Some of the cucurbits, the leaves were eaten as vegetables, but the fruits were used medicinally. So the melons. I'm trying to think of others that had multiple kinds of uses. Some of them, the leaves were eaten, but you could also eat the seeds. So like cowpea, for example, or so that's vigna or phaseolus, which is beans. Those could be eaten for the leaves, but also for the fruit. But a lot of them were mainly of the species were mainly used just for the leaves. I would say the vast majority of them.
Great, thank you. So about 10 minutes after 11, so I think we'll go ahead and conclude our talk, unless anyone has any pressing questions. You can reach Matthew at his email that he dropped in the chat. And just want to again thank you, Matthew, for coming and sharing your wonderful knowledge. And that'll conclude our talk today. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.